Welcome to ALLFIE's conference. My name's Navin Kikabai. I'll be chairing this. Steve's going to be talking about a topic which is the significance of the Children and Families Act 2014, its pitfalls and how parents of disabled children can use it to advocate for their child's right to mainstream education. Okay, so welcome everybody, and I'm going to pass straight over to Steve. So over to you, Steve.
Thanks for having me this afternoon. I've got 20 minutes to talk about the law, which is not very long, but I will do my best to give you the highlights and or the lowlights, and I'll also be very pleased to take questions as well. When we get to questions, I would need to give the disclaimer that I'm not able to give any legal advice today. Of course, it's only a talk. I'm going to try and share my screen because I'm going to talk in the time that's available about 3 sections of the Children and Families Act. And then I'm going to talk about the Equality Act, because my view is that if you only look at the Children and Families Act, you're missing a big part of the picture in terms of how we can realise the right to mainstream education for disabled children. So looking at the Children and Families Act, which I'm sure is familiar to many of you, now we're in its 10th anniversary, there are really 3 key sections to focus on for the purposes of this talk. And they're not necessarily the 3 that are in the heading mainstream education, because if you just look at those, you're missing the big one for children with EHC plans, which is section 39. But the majority of children and young people, of course, don't have EHC plans. And the position for that group is quite straightforward in section 34 of the Children and Families Act. What section 34 says is that it applies to a child or young person in England who has special educational needs, but for whom no EHC plan is maintained. So that's all the children who are without an EHC plan at that moment in time, whether that's because one hasn't been requested or because it's been refused or there's a tribunal appeal. Makes no difference. It's not, if the child or young person doesn't have an EHC plan, then they come within section 34. And that child or young person must, so there's the language of a duty, mandatory language, be educated in a maintained nursery school, mainstream school, or mainstream post-16 institution, subject to, so that's often how we see legislation, there's an exception, subsections 3 and 4. And all those allow is a short-term placement, essentially, for assessment, that's subsection 4. So the child or young person may be educated in a special school or special college during any period where they're being assessed. That's the effect of subsections 5 to 9. Or if the family are going to pay, they can be educated wherever they like in accordance with the general principle that parents can educate their children in accordance with parental views. So the child or young person may be educated in an independent school, non-maintained special school, or a special college if the cost is not to be met by a local authority or the Secretary of State, i.e. if the family are going to pay. So with those 2 very narrow exceptions, all children and young people who are disabled but don't have EHC plans must be in mainstream. That's section 34. So then we move on to think about the EHC plan process. And you might start with section 33, which is headed Children and Young People with EHC plans, but you'd be wrong, because the upper tribunal has told us that actually we need to start, and this is Emmy and Southwark, with section 39, because when parents are going through the process of having the EHC plan for the first time, or indeed in relation to annual reviews, they can request a school. As we see, this section 39 is headed request for a particular school. And so therefore parents can request a mainstream school. And the local authority, as we see at subsection 3, must, so again it's a duty, secure that the EHC plan names the school that's requested unless subsection 4 applies. So what does subsection 4 say? It says, well, that the local authority doesn't have to name that particular school if it's unsuitable for the child, the age, aptitude, ability, or special educational needs. So unsuitability is a reason not to name the school, or the attendance of the child at the school, and I'm going to deal with children just for simplicity, but this applies to young people as well, would be incompatible with the provision of efficient education for others or the efficient use of resources. And in the time available, all I'll say, and you may want to ask questions about this, is that incompatible is a very high hurdle indeed. So this doesn't allow a local authority to avoid naming a particular school, particular mainstream school sought by a family, because it would have some impact on the provision of efficient education for others, or it would have some impact on in terms of cost. It has to be incompatible with either of those two outcomes, which essentially, certainly in relation to the provision of efficient education for others, is established in the case law to be a very high bar indeed. But let's assume, for present purposes, that either the parents haven't named a particular school, or more likely, the local authority has relied on one of these exceptions and is not going to name the school, the mainstream school the parents are looking for. Then we end up in section 33. So that's the confusing part, is that section 33 is the catch-all or the fallback provision when section 39 doesn't apply. You look at it in that order, said to the upper tribunal in ME and Southwark. And so section 33 says that wherever a local authority is preparing an EHC plan for a child for school or post-16, then they must secure that the plan provides for that child or young person to be educated in a maintained nursery school, a mainstream school, or a mainstream college. Unless, so here's the exception, that's incompatible with, same language, the wishes of the child's parent or the young person. Well, let's assume for present purposes that doesn't apply because we want a mainstream school, or the provision of efficient education for others. And what's very important here is there's no exception at this stage in relation to suitability. So it's not open to a local authority to say this child is unsuitable for mainstream school. That's not a legally permissible argument for a local authority. They can say this child is unsuitable, or put the other way around, this particular school is unsuitable for this child, and so we're not going to name it in accordance with section 39, but they can't say mainstream school as a type is unsuitable. They would have to say that placing the child in any mainstream school would be incompatible with the provision of efficient education for others. And then Parliament's made it harder still for local authorities, because they can only rely on that exception in relation to mainstream schools generally, taken as a whole, if they can show that there are no reasonable steps that could be taken to prevent the incompatibility. So it's not just a question of the local authority looking at how things are now in all its mainstream schools and saying, oh, it would be incompatible with the efficient education of others for this child to go there. They've also then got to go through the process of looking at what reasonable steps they might take to prevent it being incompatible. And then in relation to a particular school, they would have to show there's no reasonable steps that the local authority or the relevant body, the governors, the proprietor, etc., could take to prevent the incompatibility. So there's a very high bar put on the local authority to allow it to rely on the exception from the right to a mainstream school place in section 33. But there is still an exception. I think it's quite interesting to compare sections 33 and section 34. So if we go back to section 34 for a minute. So this is for children who, of course, generally will have lower levels of special educational needs. And they have an effectively unqualified right to go to a mainstream school, because the only exceptions, as we saw, are where parents are choosing to pay for something else, or there's an assessment process going on. Otherwise, they must be educated in mainstream, full stop. Whereas by the time you've got to a EHC plan, and we're in section 33 territory, if we fall back here, we do now have this exception that refers to the provision of efficient education for others. And I think that might be discriminatory, and that potentially could breach Article 14 of the European Convention on Human Rights, although I don't believe that argument has ever been tested yet. If it was put forward as an argument, the Secretary of State would have to explain and provide a justification for why there should be a greater exception to the right to mainstream schooling for children with EHC plans than for those who don't. And I don't understand, I may be wrong, but my understanding is that that question hasn't been asked and the Secretary of State has never provided that explanation. So it would be interesting, I think, to ask that question. So those are the three key sections of the Children and Families Act. And what that creates, in short, then, is a very close to unqualified right to a mainstream school place for children who don't have EHC plans, and a somewhat more qualified right to a mainstream school place for those who do. But that's not the end of the story, because of course, just being in a mainstream school is not meaningful inclusion. We all know that it's perfectly possible for children to be segregated within a mainstream setting. And so that's why I wanted to flag the interplay between the Children and Families Act and the Equality Act, and the fact that the Equality Act duties, of course, apply to schools now, and that encompasses the duty to make reasonable adjustments. So schools have the reasonable adjustments duty here in section 20. But importantly, the way that the duty operates in relation to schools is amended by Schedule 13 to the Equality Act, very deep in the Act. We'll have a look at that in a moment. So on its face, the reasonable adjustments duty comprises 3 requirements. The physical features requirement is the one that perhaps is most often thought about. So where a physical feature puts a disabled person at a substantial disadvantage in comparison with non-disabled people, steps is reasonable to have to take to avoid the disadvantage, so change the physical environment in some way. Perhaps in education, the most important of the requirements, though, is the first, PCPs, provisions, criterion or practices, policies, the way schools do things. If any of those things put a disabled person at a substantial disadvantage, then they must be varied. Policies must be changed in a way that is reasonable for the school to do. And there's lots of guidance as to what would be reasonable and the factors that schools must take into account and must not take into account. There's also, importantly, the third requirement, which applies to schools, which is about auxiliary aids, which can include people as well. So actually support workers or staff, they must be provided where it would put a disabled person at a substantial disadvantage not to have that auxiliary aid. And that applies to schools just as much as other bodies too. But the point I wanted to make in relation to Schedule 13, within Schedule 13, we have some important amendments to how the reasonable adjustments duty works for schools. And we see that, first of all, they only have to comply with the first and third requirement. So physical features are dealt with through the accessibility planning duty on schools. So for schools, it's the PCP requirement and the auxiliary aid requirement that applies. But then importantly here, where those requirements refer to a disabled person, it's amended to mean disabled persons generally. And that's what makes the duty on schools anticipatory, because it has to not just be about the individual disabled person, but all disabled people. And what does their provision, criterion or practice mean in terms of disadvantage for disabled people or a group of disabled people generally, and what disadvantage might arise from not providing an auxiliary aid or service to disabled people generally, disabled pupils generally. So that's really important to keep in mind, and it's something the Upper Tribunal has emphasised recently in disability discrimination claims against schools, and the First Tier Tribunal is grappling with now in terms of directions when someone is arguing that there's been a failure to make reasonable adjustments. The Tribunal is now starting to say, well, you need to explain to us what the class of disabled people are that are disadvantaged by this PCP, this provision, criterion or practice, not just that you yourself were disadvantaged by it. And then it's also important to see what the relevant matters are to which these duties apply, specifically decisions on who to admit to the school, and then the very general point, provision of education or access to a benefit, facility or service. So anything the school does in terms of either educating children or other kinds of benefits, facilities and services that might be offered are within the scope of the Equality Act duties and the reasonable adjustments duty. What isn't within the scope expressly is the decision to exclude someone, the actual exclusion decision itself. But the things that are done on the run-up to that will be within the definition of provision of education or access to a benefit, facility or service. So that's just another point to watch out for. So the Equality Act is, of course, quite technical, as we've just seen, but it is critically important, I'd suggest, that mainstream schools have the Section 20 duty as amended by Schedule 13 and in relation to, as we were looking before, the first and third requirements. Because without this, then what you might have from the Children and Families Act alone is a bare duty to admit the child, to have them present in the school, but without the requirement to actually adjust practices, the delivery of the curriculum and so on, in a way that is going to make their inclusion meaningful within the classroom, within the life of the school. So my overall message to the group, and subject to questions, of course, is that the Children and Families Act duties are the foundation and are the gateway to inclusion in mainstream, but they're not enough on their own, and that it's critically important to keep the Equality Act in mind as well when you're thinking about what it is that schools have to do to make inclusion real.
Thank you so much, Steve, for being part of our conference this year. We do appreciate it.